Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Create webinar brought to you at the special time of 10 a.m. Australian to accommodate time zones and our very special guests from Canada. It's really a great pleasure to introduce our Canadian friends, and I'll do that in a moment. I first want to acknowledge that this webcast is going out from Gadigal land. I want to acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and pay respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. So thanks so much everyone for joining us. As you know, the Create Centre is focused on how we apply creativity in the arts in our world, and I can't think of two better proponents of those kinds of ideas. I've known Kathleen Gallagher for longer than we'd both probably want to admit, but Kathleen has been an absolute leader in the field, finding new ways to research, understand and engage with the arts, and particularly in different kinds of communities, in different kinds of diverse communities. And Andrew's work, of course, as a playwright and a worker in the arts also speaks for itself. As I said to Kathleen and Andrew, I'm not going to spend time going over their CVs. You can have a look at their work Anna's going to drop a link to their CVs and their work, so you can have a look at that at your leisure. But it is a great pleasure to welcome them both off the back of their new book, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they've both got to say. So over to you, Kathleen and Andrew.
So Toronto, or Takaranto, the original Mohawk word for Toronto, meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing, is said to refer to the wooden stakes that were used as fishing weirs in the narrows of local river systems. For thousands of years, this land on which Andrew and I and others of my lovely colleagues who have joined currently learn and play has been the traditional land of the Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work, to create, and to be together on this land. And as a settler on this land, with my people coming from Ireland and Scotland, I've learned that the paths that I walk every day around the University of Toronto where I work are built on the portage trails first established and walked by many Indigenous peoples and communities. I feel called to learn from these original caretakers of the land and to share in the responsibility for its flourishing.
I'd like to add my own reflection. As I reflect on the land, I reflect on its original caretakers. I reflect on the present tense of this care, that it's both historic and current, it is ongoing, and that it's incumbent on me to develop a relationship with Indigenous peoples here and now. I'm reminded that this past year I worked with a very celebrated two-spirited Indigenous artist named Gloria Eshkabach. Gloria said to me on the first day of rehearsals that instead of settler, she prefers the word stranger, that those who originally came to this land were strangers. And she uses this term with great hope that it may motivate the stranger to become less strange, to enter a relationship and dialogue with the land and its original and ongoing stewards. I also reflect on other parts of this world where people are being separated from their land through genocidal violence, colonization, and imperialism. I'm Ukrainian. All of my grandparents hailed from Western Ukraine. I'm not suggesting a parallel to the genocides of Indigenous people in my part of the world, but in this past 8 months, I've witnessed firsthand the suffering of friends and family forcibly separated from their homeland, navigating an ongoing threat of annihilation. It has never been more clear to me that here, close to home, we must confront the historic harms and systems, current systems, that have attempted to erase complete peoples and cultures. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's a very kind of comprehensive and exciting way to start our webinar today. Now, I'm going to pass over to you, to Kathleen, to take us through some of your work. I believe we've got some play readings in store. So very excited to hear about the work and the way it's formed and the way it's going. So over to you.
Okay, Andrew, where shall we begin? We proposed some questions that we could speak to, but are not wedded to these. Do you have those there, Michael?
I do, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Do you have them? Do you have them, Michael?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
No, not
great,
in
Andrew.
front of me, but if you want to flick them to me, I'm happy to pose them in that way, or you can, go
Andrew,
your own way.
I could
Yeah,
pop them in the
sounds good.
chat if that's useful. Shall I do that?
I think we can surf through
it's
these,
okay.
and then what would be
Andrew
lovely is to
has them.
see. Yeah, I have them here, and it would be lovely to we can navigate our way through them, and then it would be great to actually get to meet some of you in this circle and find out what curiosities you're sitting with and things we may be able to speak to. But one of the things that I've got the book right here. This is our publication, Hope in a Collapsing World. Something that Kathleen and I both have written into is this notion of the artist researcher or the researcher artist. This idea that we can trouble the silos, that notion that a researcher is exclusively so or an artist is exclusively so. And I suppose I'll kick off this question of how did we come about this notion by sharing how Kathleen and I met. And that was back in 2009. It was in Toronto here. My company, which is called Project Humanity, it's a leading developer of verbatim theater in Canada. I don't know if folks are familiar with verbatim theater, but in essence, plays constructed from what I call recorded encounters, which are transcribed and then dramatized. I'd created a piece called The Middle Place. And The Middle Place was born of interviews with youth in the shelter system here in Toronto, specifically in a community called Rexdale, a community that struggles on multiple fronts. And I had been commissioned to write a play about that community. I felt daunted by the notion of fictionalizing their stories, and so came about this idea of meeting them, talking to them, recording them while we were concurrently running drama workshops in the room next door. And The Middle Place was a play born of those meetings. And we toured it through the Toronto District School Board here in Toronto, and happened to be at one of Kathleen's sites. And we initially crossed paths in the drama classroom. In fact, myself and a colleague, Antonio Cayon, did a verbatim theater workshop as a kind of primer for that group before they saw the play. Sparks started to fly into the air, albeit early first meeting of Kathleen and her team. It was certainly my first experience of seeing researchers in the field in this way. And then the class experienced the show along with a couple of hundred other students. And my vivid memory is after the play, Kathleen, coming up to me and saying, "You've written an ethnodrama," which, this is my first verbatim play. The word had no meaning to me whatsoever. I was deeply impressed that I had done something. And the fact that ethnodrama meant that there was a kind of, I'll share my interpretation in that moment of what ethnodrama meant. In some way that the work had implications or could have implications well beyond the theater going experience. That by virtue of embracing young people as the experts of their own experience and of their lives, which I'd say is a key tenet that is shared by both Kathleen and me in our practices, by virtue of embracing them as experts, sharing that expertise with audiences, that there was the capacity for this work of art to affect change, to be an agent of social change. That's what I gathered from this new term that Kathleen presented to me. And really for me, that was the start of a really lush, vivid, we're going on, what is it now? It's like 13 years of this conversation that we're having about what does it mean to listen to young people differently? What does it mean to take a walk in their words in some cases? What does it mean to make sense of their lives with the public and with them? And myriad offshoots that we'll talk about today. But I will say that was sort of the moment, for me, the sort of the birth of this notion of artist, researcher, artist, the blend.
Mhm. I'll just add something brief to that, Andrew. You've captured that meeting of minds and hearts and passions and commitments really well. When we were trying to write about the origin of our meeting and the development of our work over time, it was actually you, Andrew, that posed the researcher-artist, artist-researcher positions. And this is nothing startling or new. People use such terms. But when we pushed ourselves to investigate why we were using them, what we realized in both the research work that we were doing and the theater making that came from that research, we were, both of us in different ways, pressing into the hyphen. We were pressing into that space between what it means to be a researcher and an artist, whether one is considering oneself at any given moment a researcher or an artist, that the ethics and the aesthetics of those terms were forcefully present in both directions. And so it's a way that when I look back at the work in the field, if you're an ethnographer, and then the work in the rehearsal hall, subsequently later when you're making a play, it was spacious in terms of the role of research in the art making and the role of art in the research making. And so it's sort of a question that Andrew and I continue to ponder, because I think for me, it's not a definition and it's not really a position, but it's the hyphen that I find endlessly interesting. And we keep creating working relationships for ourselves to further explore what that can mean, what kinds of things we feel held to as theater makers and as researchers, and particularly with young people, which is a long and shared commitment that both Andrew and I have.
One thing that's occurring to me, Kathleen, is you introduced me to the metaphor of the side door, which I feel is a shared one, given our interests, practices, our relationships. The way you introduced the notion of side door to me was that the drama classroom and the activities of that space afford us sometimes a side door onto conversations that are at best difficult to have in a very direct way, and at times impossible. The art triangulates, and I'm struck by the extent to which in both of our practices, the side door is in play. Art that fully dives into an issue with the absence of metaphor becomes didactic. It becomes a lecture. It becomes the chastising of the public, the forceful redirecting of the public. I'm much more interested in art that provides a side door on these conversations and these issues. And I have a feeling, albeit maybe I wasn't able to articulate it back then, that was something that you and I were invested in the capacity for a third way.
Yeah, that's well said, Andrew, because I feel like that's a lesson I learned a very, very long time ago. I hardly think about it anymore because it's become so embedded in how I work with young people, whether that's in a school setting or in a community setting, wherever, whatever kind of drama space we're working in. And this is true, as you say, of the art, of the both how the art gets created and then also how the art further communicates beyond the moment of encounter or exchange. But it's really, really deeply true for me in terms of research, because when I think about social science research, when I think about methodologies and the various methods that are often deployed in all kinds of course, we know the legacy and histories of deeply unethical, harmful research practices, that many of the methods still at play carry these histories, have not given much attention or care to what it means to create relationships, what it means to be co-researchers in a given context. And so this idea of the side door is both a way to look at vulnerability and also to keep a community safe and protected in the midst of difficult explorations. And I think that youth research in particular has not been very good at that, has created a very paternalistic idea about young people. And so from the start, and it's what Andrew said at the beginning, this idea of people being experts of their own lives, it was not widely held in ethnographic research, particularly with youth communities. And so everybody is coming in through the side door. Everybody is making decisions about what is spoken and what is unspoken, what needs to be looked at from a safe distance rather than head on. And so I feel like just the ethics of however we're working in those drama spaces is in the foreground. If we think both about the safety of that, the gentleness of that non-confrontational side door, but also that door is a screen door, that space, that drama space is not impervious. It's in a deep and long relationship with all of the histories and the lives and lived experiences of all of the things beyond that drama space. And so while that particular space, I feel, at least for me, over my whole career, has afforded certain kinds of engagements and relationship building and daring questioning and exploration with young people, it also is one that is in this very alive relationship with all of those things on the other side of the screen door, which are the world's lived realities, preoccupations, concerns, worries, and dreams that happen outside that drama space. And so I feel like, yes, that metaphor of both how we approach working together, and also what the stage actually is. There's an old, many of you will know this, but I've been in classrooms where drama teachers have said, leave your stuff outside, because in here we're this special community of trust. And
tap the wall, right? Tap the wall.
What's that? Tap the wall. Yeah. Leave that stuff out there. And I've been really lucky over my long career to build relationships with drama teachers who orient themselves very differently to the lives and worlds of young people beyond those classroom walls. And in fact, have foregrounded, have made those lives the curriculum. And so that's a political orientation, that's a pedagogical orientation. And I think, back to the launching question, it was something that I could see as a shared commitment when I first saw Andrew and his colleague work with young people. And then when I saw the play that they made, and the students' reactions to that play, and the ways in which they wanted to keep that conversation going, because it felt like a real invitation. No more shame or exclusion of the hard things or the things that don't properly belong in a school or in a classroom, even a drama classroom. And suddenly there was an opening with a kind of care and protectiveness around those difficult conversations or vulnerable explorations. And I think, this kind of aesthetics of care, what James Thompson calls an aesthetics of care, became really central to how we, as collaborators, Andrew and I, wanted to keep building and working with that metaphor, and letting it evolve and grow and see how it moved in different directions.
Just looking at the cover here and having the book at my side, the book is such an extraordinary way, I think, of gleaning more of that hyphen and how the art appears in the research and how the research appears in the art. And even that sort of sounds simplistic to me. It's so much more braided than that. Mm-hmm. And I think, no spoiler, the extent to which we were even able to, do more research on the other side of sharing the voices that we encountered in the world with audiences here in Toronto, and that the audience suddenly became a further sounding board, a further meaning maker in all of this work. And it's not the first time Kathleen has been a part of the audience experience in that way, the audience research, just to sort of, again, figure out how are young people responding to seeing themselves represented or misrepresented on stage. How do so-called adult audiences engage with the voices of young people, what they're trying to get across to us. One of the central, I'd say it's the inciting incident of Towards Youth, a play on radical hope, which is the play that's in this text, is a student named Bella saying, "How are you going to hear me?" Asking Kathleen that question, "How are you going to hear me? When you've done all this research with all these other young people, how are you not just going to hear your research or those others?" And I feel like it's a gorgeous and urgent provocation from a young person to go, how are you in fact going to receive me as I am, on my own terms, in my own voice? I don't know if you have anything to add to that before I move on to the next question, Kathleen.
I did have something, but something you said earlier. It's okay. It's gone. I'm sure it will come back.
It will come back.
Yeah.
So the subtitle of the book is Youth, Theater, and Listening as a Political Alternative. The subtitle of the play is a play on radical hope. Radical hope was a concept that was a cornerstone of Kathleen's ethnographic research, one in which her project, one that embedded an artist. And I think that's something we speak to in the book, that this wasn't an example of a researcher after having extraordinary moments in the field going, oh, I think this might make a good play. This was actually a researcher from the outset going, an artist needs to be in the circle, and an artist needs to be in the center, along with the other constituents of this project. And maybe, Kathleen, you could speak to a little bit that impulse. And I know it's born of, again, us having worked on another project and some forays into dramatizing your ethnographic research, but could you speak a little bit to why embed an artist?
Well, there were things that came to make a lot of sense to me in terms of plays being an output from research, because if theater methodologically was so central, we were in places where theater was being made. We were using methods of theater to pursue questions of interest to the research and to everyone in the room. So it seemed very natural that one of the ways we would want to communicate what we'd learned in the research was through the vehicle of a play, but not as a mouthpiece, as something which in its own terms is sharing things, is outstretching its own arms. So yeah, from the start, that seemed very obvious to me. But I also what was unanticipated at that time, which became really interesting later, is how the research itself and the researchers would become the object of study for an artist. And there was something, I don't know why I didn't think of that initially, but when that started to become clear to me, that we were also, in a sense, putting the research itself under a kind of microscope, but I'll say the microscope was an embedded, a loving, a caring, trusting kind of microscope, that then we would be able to be more reflexive about the research we were doing. If we were, if a playwright was pursuing questions to better understand what was happening in a research space, that opened up another kind of framing around what it was we were doing. And it made us conscious of our actions as researchers in a really different way. Not only because they were going to be represented, which wasn't the part I was thinking about very often, but more so because Andrew is being driven by artistic questions that have to do with creating spaces, imagining other spaces beyond the one we were in, about the ethics of representing voices and what is at play when you make those decisions. And so, yeah, I would say that impulse to, because this was a long study, the Radical Hope study. It was over 5 years, and so it was a big commitment. It was asking Andrew and others, ultimately later artists who would perform the play, to stay in the circle with us, to stay committed to that project for a long period of time, to in fact grow with us, and to provide a kind of set of artistic and creation questions that would stretch us as ethnographic researchers, that would hold us to account in different sorts of ways. So yeah, I think some of that I anticipated, and then other things I learned, especially in the rehearsal hall, when I think you and your co-director, Chris Abraham, decided that the play also needed or had a research dramaturg. And what would that mean? What does it mean when the research is in an enduring conversation with the theater making, the art making, the same way that the art was in an enduring conversation when we were in the field. And I'll just say, one of the inspired choices that Andrew made when we found ourselves right at the beginning of that rehearsal process, with very big questions about how to act from an ethics of care in relationship to the young people and teachers and artists in cultural contexts that were not our own, with whom we'd had a long relationship with over many years, how we were going to truly do justice to not just the voices, but the relationships, the three-dimensionality of those, of what Andrew called the encounters. And so we had that there at the outset, aware of all of the ethical and artistic questions to do, and research questions to do with representation and voice and caretaking. And so Andrew invited the collaborators in India, Taiwan, Greece, and England to write to the actors, to engage in a kind of discourse with them about not nailing it, not not accuracy, not in a documentary sense, performing them well, but rather instead what was really critical to those people, to their commitments, to their orientation to the world of theater, and their orientation to the young people with whom they work in these culturally different sites. And there began another kind of exchange, encounter between the so-called real people and the people who would later represent them. And this was one of various kinds of rehearsal choices that intended to keep alive the relationships and the evolution of relationships and the accountability through the entire process. So I've probably gone off too long on that, but radical hope, which was the cornerstone of the research, was, as I saw it early on, and any researchers in the room will know that you propose a research project sometimes years before the research project is unfolding. So you're just dreaming. You're dreaming a grant proposal. It's all a dream. And my notion of radical hope in those conception years was that what I had already learned from years and years of work with young people was that hope was not a possession. Hope was not an affect. Hope was not a thing to have or to lose, but that hope was a practice. And the reason why I called it radical hope and not just any old kind of hope is because I'd learned that lesson by watching young people in some of the most dire circumstances that I could imagine, practicing hope when everything around them would suggest that it was hopeless. So it was hope despite hopelessness. And that seemed to me a different kind of hope. And it wasn't something that you had or didn't have. It was something that you practiced, particularly in the face of conditions and contexts that would not readily invite hope.
Yeah. And in our sites, I mean, just to anchor that even further, you know, when I think of the contexts we were in, so in Greece, you had, at the time of our research, both a deep economic crisis, humanitarian crisis, refugee crisis. We found ourselves in Coventry in England for our research there the day before the Brexit vote in 2016, and we all know how that turned out. So deep upheaval. In Taiwan, we were engaging with young people who were surviving the anxiety of China and its pressures on Taiwan as a country, on that democracy. In Toronto, engaging with young people that were struggling, navigating racial tensions in their classrooms. And in India, an all-girl school engaging with the patriarchy there, the systems that attempt to lock them in a social position, and their resistance to that social position. And so these are sort of the contexts that the book, I think, really makes vivid. And to just build on what Kathleen, I always try, I play the game of what is radical hope for me today, because I do think it is a kind of metaphor. It is something we get to play with. It's a toy. Today I wrote, it isn't about the horizon. It's about being with others looking to a horizon together. And for me, it's that action. It's the collective effort. It's not aspirational. It's not about, we don't know if tomorrow is going to be better, but how can, in our being with one another, in our creating together, in our honoring of difference, how can we make it a hopeful space? And I have to say that in the drama classroom, Kathleen has said this previously, I love it. I love this notion that the drama classroom is a workshop for hope. It's where hope gets honed and practiced and nurtured. It's a space, of course, rife with failure and, creative disaster, catastrophe. But I do think fundamentally there are things in play in the drama classroom that, is the stuff of moving through the world in a more compassionate and caring way. It's something we witnessed. It's something we paid deep attention to. I felt humbled by it, in fact, when I saw it in its most vivid terms over the course of our years of research. Segueing to the drama classroom. And so what do we perceive in the classroom in the drama classroom specifically, that fleshes out this notion of care? What does the drama classroom teach us when it comes to care? And I'll maybe offer an opening notion that something that struck me on a recurring basis, but I got to say, there was a really vivid incident in Coventry where this was, and Kathleen, you write about the circle in Coventry after the Brexit result. But for me, I really fixate on the notion of how the drama classroom is not set up like most other classrooms in the building. It's not desks facing one direction. It's in fact a more challenging shape, but also a more dynamic shape, which is the circle. And in the circle, albeit I think initially it can provoke a mask of cool, or it can, folks may feel a little bit vulnerable and withdraw. I do think what I've seen, whether it's my drama work in the shelter system, in high schools, or even with an ensemble, eventually the circle can soften those masks, and it becomes a space where people are accountable to one another. They have to show up for one another. You can see who's sleeping in the circle. You can see who's burning in the circle. And so I feel like that was one of the things that I relished about the spaces we were in. And there was a really extraordinary moment in the Toronto site that Kathleen and her student at the time, Dr. Dirk Roderick, observed in the Toronto classroom, wherein a group discussion in the circle suddenly morphed into a more linear shape. And what ended up happening was when white female voices in the room started to dominate the brainstorm, Black male voices in the circle fell silent. And suddenly what moved from, again, a more tenuous, volatile, exciting dynamic, which is the dynamic of the circle, I feel, as soon as it moved into the linearity, the chalkboard, sort of everybody facing one way, jotting ideas down. As soon as that happened, the Black voices in the room fell silent. The Black male voices fell silent. And that appears in the play. It's in fact dramatized, something that in reading the play, it won't be quite as easy to imagine, is that there was a movement piece actually that an actor, Stephen Jackman Torkoff, offered alongside Kathleen sharing the findings of that moment in the Toronto site. And that's always punctured me. That's always impacted me, the extent to which that shape is so precious and so much is possible. And when it breaks down, there are real consequences. So I hold that as a teaching.
I can pick up there, Andrew, because you were bringing to mind for me another event in the Toronto site where we did our work over these years. And it was a real example that I think if anyone has worked in a drama classroom in this room, you're going to recognize it. And it was an effort to create a kind of docudrama about the real life of one of the young men in the group. And in this case, it was the story of him coming to hearing through a surgical intervention because he was born deaf. So this was the story of a cochlear implant that he and his peers decided to make public. And it wasn't something that this young man had ever shared with his peers before. And it's certainly not to the wider school population the parent community in the evening, all kinds of publics that wouldn't have known this story. And I'm telling you this story because I watched the development process of that piece of theater, student-led, student-directed, student-created. I watched over several weeks a group of peers holding with such care this story. And they, at a certain point, became so concerned with doing the story justice and representing it utterly accurately that they reached for an expression of theater that was probably the least, nobody knew it at the time, but the least able to contain their theater making practice of care. So they went for a kind of realism. You may not be surprised to hear that in a high school drama classroom, which in the end failed if what we're counting is how an audience receives a piece of theater. They didn't receive it well. The piece didn't communicate the care with which it had been created. The peers of the young man were enraged that the audience had not understood the importance of this incredible story that they had chosen to tell. And when we talked about it, debriefed that experience, it was a learning for everyone that the disappointment was not that the play hadn't received recognition from the audience, but that what they had created, the piece of theater that they had created, couldn't adequately communicate the care with which they had held the story of their classmate. And so we were able in that moment to really tease out what can happen in a drama classroom, in a rehearsal process that can be so capable of building relationships, building ideas, holding with great care the stories of others. And then how can that fall down so badly when it's represented for another audience? And it was such a learning for the young people to recognize that that choices can occur that make the process of developing a creative idea not appreciable to an audience. And this is a more kind of extensive learning, but really it's learning from failure. If we want to simply call that experience failure, it wasn't for the boy whose story was told. He was very clear with his peers and clear with me, clear with the researchers, that it didn't matter at all to him how this was received by strangers in an audience. What mattered was the care that he had felt by his peers in developing that story. So there were many lessons in that for me, not least of which is the value of failure and being able to look at and make that failure mean so much more than what it sometimes comes to mean, in the ta-da moment of sharing a piece of work. And so there was a lot of learning, obviously, for us who were watching the thing unfold. And there was so much learning for what it means to find yourself in a classroom, not only held by your peers, where suddenly you realize my voice is consequential. My voice matters. My story matters. And I'm going to, he talked about it this way, I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to take the risk to share it. So to me, in other parts of the book, I trace not just Toronto, but in all of the sites, there were these moments where I think the activist voice gets awakened. And then those young people grow an expectation that the world should hear them, should hear from them, that what they have to say matters. And that doesn't occur in lots of other places in school. We all know this. And so the drama classroom at its best, when it's giving its greatest gifts, I think that's what it's doing. I think it's saying your voice is consequential. Other people will readily become players in the activation of your story and your voice. You can count on that. And then further, you can expect that a broader world should value what it is that you uniquely are bringing, whether on a stage or in a classroom, or indeed in other parts of their lives. So that's a big takeaway from the research for me, that I saw this repeated in various ways in the various sites of the research, where of course the drama teacher is pivotal. The drama teacher who both trusts and sets the bar, who says, I'm with you on this consequential work, but I am following your lead. And in Toronto, we had exactly that teacher. We had that amazing teacher who imparted in so many ways, and in the youth interviews, they said it over and over. He trusts us. He trusts us. He trusts us. He trusts us to make a mistake. He trusts us to fix things when they're not working. So I really feel more and more that the lucky person who gets to occupy that position, how they curate that circle, how they empower theater makers to make their own mistakes, make their own choices, and who also expects much, because this isn't simply a question of hands off. That never works, but who expects much and receives much. In the drama education world, one of the pioneers, Dorothy Heathcott, was asked, as many of you will know, many years ago, how do you become a good teacher? And I loved her answer. She said, I have no idea. I only know that teaching has something to do with receiving. That was really the landing point after many years. So I've seen a lot of drama teachers who are receivers. And I think that's an unusual and very fortunate position to find yourself in if you're a teacher.
Yeah, what's pinging for me is that notion of how are you going to hear me? How are you going to hear me? And the extent to which the drama teacher that is a receiver, that is capable, well, there's this other finding of yours, Kathleen, the extent to which young people do not believe themselves to be the group that we often perceive them to be, or want them to be, or categorize them as. And I think that was abundant in the research, the extent to which young people were going, we're not a group as a given, we're not an ensemble as a given, that indeed that is an achievement. We can achieve a group vibe, we can achieve an ensemble, but that's not by virtue of casting a blanket over differences or leveling the space. It really is about building something together that receives the individual, the particulars of a person, their context, their relationships. And so I feel that that's something that, again, as a kind of finding, or as a kind of recurring experience in the field, pings for me. Yeah. How about some discoveries in the playmaking? So moving the data into an aesthetic space. And, one thing I will, and this is one of my, I don't know what the metaphor is. It's like one of my it's not an axe to grind. That's a bit harsh, but you know, it's this notion of intercultural work and making space for intergenerational work that requires just as much care and consideration. I think there is this sort of free pass that a lot of artists give themselves, a lot of programmers give themselves, be it, you know, playwrights give themselves, performers give themselves, that just by virtue of having been young once, we have the right to represent young people on stage. And usually most young people engaging with those representations sort of like put up with it. They put up with it. But it doesn't mean that it's the way things ought to be. And one thing that I really challenged, and Towards Youth, the cast, the ensemble of Towards Youth, everybody was an adult in that cast. And I can speak a little bit to why that title became the title. But for me, it was really mission critical for us to approach these voices with as much humility, as much labor as we would any other kind of border crossing that we're asking an artist to do. I do think young people deserve better in terms of how they are represented. And so I don't know if you want to speak to that, Kathleen, a little bit, but it's one of my, like, you know, it makes my skin crawl a little bit, the license that folks in my sector will take with regards to, you know, what it means to talk about young people in art.
Well, I think, Andrew, I think you should give them some voices.
Yeah.
I think, yeah,
okay.
I do. I
so,
think we should.
I'm going to read from Canley. So,
Canley?
yeah,
Sorry,
do you
Andrew,
want to contextualize? You can contextualize Canley if you like.
No. I just, this is this, just outside Coventry. I won't call it a suburb. It's an area of in Coventry in England where there is a lot of socioeconomic struggle, where young people especially have been underserved, and where at the time of our arrival there were terrible local budget cuts that were threatening the few spaces that young people in that particular area were having, where the life expectancy was, I think, 12 years life expectancy difference between two bus stops. So this to give you a sense of the degree of struggle in this particular community. Andrew, we have until 8:15, and so after we share some Canley youth voices, and this was they met in a leisure center. This was an after-school theater making space, because the English curriculum has effectively omitted drama from the official curriculum. So young people who seek out their drama making spaces after school, and that's where we were in this leisure center where Canley Youth Theatre met, which was part of the Belgrade Theatre. Belgrade Theatre, a very large mainstream theatre making company in Coventry that had a whole range of pretty extraordinary outreach programs to various different youth. And one of those youth communities was Canley Youth. So this was run by the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry.
Scene 11, Canley Youth Theatre, 2016. We hear the sound of Canley Youth Theatre Group pre-interview conferring excitedly. Andrew speaks to the audience. Andrew says, June 26, 2016. Kathleen and I have flown to Coventry, England. It's the week of the Brexit referendum. Coventry is located 138 kilometers northwest of London, a 1-hour train ride, and is home to the Coventry Cathedral, which was brutally bombed by the Germans in the Coventry Blitz. The research site here is Canley Youth Theatre, a well-funded drama club for teenagers hailing from one of Coventry's most struggling suburbs. A whoop is issued by the young people as their group life force surges and then gives way to Kathleen, who says, "First of all, thank you for coming on the bus from school." Various youth overlapping voices relay how it was their pleasure. "There was so much surrounding coming here," says Kathleen, "with the Brexit vote just 3 days ago, and you in the middle of all of it. You performed your play last night, and that cut to the heart of all of it for me. There wasn't anywhere else in the world I wanted to be other than right there, right then." Nina and Ophelia say, "Aw," then giggle. Kathleen says, "How are you guys feeling?" Ophelia, speaking through a laugh or giggle almost constantly, says, "It was amazing. It really was, literally. It was. I really enjoyed it. And I was so happy that it went very well. And the audience was on our side. So that was really good." Kathleen says, "Oh yeah?" Ophelia goes on, "They left leaving the room really inspired. Yeah, so I thought it was really fun to be a 14-year-old and like do that. I don't know, what do you think?" Nina says, "My mom was just complimenting me the whole night." Luke says, "Yeah, so I was pleased with how it went." Kathleen says, "Was she?" Nina says, "She said it was a lot better than the other play I did." There's laughter from the group. John says, "And I think some people were a tad nervous about that, but then it's like we'd rehearsed it in bits and bobs, and then in the end, the bits and bobs all came together." Luke says, "Yeah." John says, "I think every time you do a performance like that with people, we all were kind of close together because you've shared an experience." Various students say, "Yeah." John says, "And days like yesterday stay with us forever. In the future, you maybe make reference to yesterday and stuff." Bruce says, "I felt like it was a good performance and we got good reactions from the people." Kathleen, Luke says, "I felt like I had done something really good because the way I see it, that in life, I feel like in life, not every person in the world has to do something world changing. Not every person in the world has to cure a disease. I just think anyone who can go through life and do something small, even improve one person's life just a little bit and make them feel welcome, then you've had a good life." Ophelia says, I'm really fast when I'm speaking because I really want to say something. But when I'm on stage, I'm very, very different. I take my time. And I think this is my stage. And I want to show." Nina says, "No, Ophelia, this is our stage." Kathleen, "It's both. It's both." Nina, "It's everyone's stage. And the audience, it's our stage." John says, "Makes me feel so confident. I feel most alive when I'm on stage." Bruce says, "And then the other people in the group were very caring. So that's what's good about having Canley Youth." Yeah. Kathleen says, "And do you imagine theater is something you'll keep up?" Ophelia says, "Oh, I'm an actress." Kathleen, "Oh, you're an actress." Nina, "You're just an actress. You don't even have to act to be an actress. You're just naturally an actress." Max says, "Well, that is one thing I always like to think about, which is kind of a big question, a bit too early. I don't know, for career choices, do I go with science or do I go with acting?" And it's a pretty big choice because I love both of them and they are complete opposite things. Kathleen says, "And when do you have to make those decisions in school where you have to focus on one or the other?" Max says, "Well, it's when you take, science is always compulsory, but it depends on your option sheet. Do I take drama or not?" So that's the kind of time where you really make your mind up and you need to, this is basically, it's like, here's a street that can change your life forever. Choose wisely. Good luck. Andrew says, "Can I ask how old you are?" Max says, "I'm 12 and a half. Ophelia says, "Yeah. This one time, I remember we were doing prime numbers and we were doing this prime number rap and I was doing this and I was singing with it and everybody kept looking at me and what is she doing?" And I'm like, "Prime, P-R-I-M-E, factors, P-R-I-M-E." She dissolves into laughter. Her peers have been encouraging her. Once Kathleen clocks that Bruce is unable to speak over the other youth's excited group life force, she gives him her attention. The other youth follow suit. And Bruce says, "No, before I did that performance, I'd be more sit back, let someone else take the leadership role and I'd chip in there ideas, but I was never really a leader person. I'd more sit back and not let everyone else do the work, but I wasn't confident to take leadership myself. But in the performance, I stood up in front of everyone and I said, I'm not afraid, I'm not embarrassed to say I'm a foster child anymore." There's a 2-second pause. And then Kathleen says, "That was a very powerful moment in the performance." Bruce says, "Yeah." John says, "I'm going to repeat my quote from Confucius, one of my favorite quotes. Find the job you love and you'll never have to work a day in your life." Kathleen says, "That's a good one." John says, Andrew says, "That went in." John says, "You just had your world rocked." There's laughter in the room. Luke says, "One more thing. I think obviously there are loads of people, young people, that don't know what they're talking about. But then again, there are loads of adults that don't know what they're talking about." Max says the news is showing that in the referendum, the 65 and older, they voted the most to leave. And the average time they'll have to live with the decision was about 9 years or something. With us, Luke says, we've got the rest of our lives. The youth murmur in agreement. And then Bruce finally says, we usually alter information to say part of the truth, but not actually say the full truth because we're too afraid to say the full truth. So the fact that in the performance last night, our stories cloaked truth so that truth could be accepted is quite, I thought that was quite symbolic. Young people interviewed the day after Brexit. Drama nerds. I see that it is 8:01 p.m. here. I'll venture to say it's 11:01 a.m. for you all, Australia, if my math serves me. Why don't we open the floor for the last 14 minutes and see if there are any questions in our circle today.
So the best way to get questions going is either just to raise your hand, even though I hate the whole raising hands thing, but anyway, raise your hands as an emoji, or just feel free to drop a comment in the box. I might do two things on the way there while people are thinking about questions. One is to say, if you are enjoying this conversation, please feel free to join Create. It's free, and you'll hear about all of the kinds of conversations like these that we have on a regular basis, and keep updated with those. And the second thing is actually a question, which is there's Hope's got a little bit of a battering, Kathleen, as you will have seen in recent conferences, and Andrew, I'm sure you've seen this as well, as kind of, I suppose, raising hopes unjustifiably. To what extent is radical hope different to that, or are there issues with what some people have called cruel optimism, kind of engaging with radical hope? So I suppose I'm asking, is there a valid critique of radical hope that it raises expectations and possibilities unrealistically?
I can jump in with that. So in the recent conference where I heard hope critiqued, I heard the critique slightly differently. I heard the critique from some that hope is not political, that to hope is somehow frivolous or without real teeth, without real commitment to change. And I'm going to paraphrase my longtime collaborator, Dr. Urvashi Sani, who is our collaborator in India, who basically says that it's a privilege to not hope. That people who say hope isn't enough, or I'm done hoping, we need real action, have usually the luxury to say such things. But in her experience, hope is fundamental, particularly to the young women that she works with in Lucknow, India. Hope is fundamental to creating solidarity, to creating ensemble, to engaging where we hold one another in those hopes in the face of hopelessness. And so she often, because of the context in India and the population of the school being young women who are mainly domestic servants, who are of the lowest class and caste in India, who would not otherwise be in school because of the systems of caste at play there. She is often accused of raising hopes, as you said, of imagining a world which just is not the world as given. But when did things ever change if we take the world as given, as something unmovable? There are too many people not at the table, too many people disenfranchised from the corridors of power. And so she would say it's a luxury to say hope isn't enough, because hope is fundamental to building what is required to actually change a world which holds many in contempt and disregard. So I like her response. I like that response. Very reasonable to raise hopes in a world that needs deep and profound challenge. And as for the critique that hope is not political enough, the practice of hope, as I've seen it, particularly with young people, is probably the most politically alive thing I've seen in about a decade. So our hollowed out democracies are not really where the politics of change are happening.
Thanks, Kathleen. Andrew, did you want to add to that?
Well, I want to read from the play, actually, just a little from Urvashi, actually, because again, I feel like that critique of hope is fixed in, again, a sort of sense of it being aspirational, about the horizon. And so anyway, I want to call on some of Urvashi's last words in the play, because I think she's sort of addressing this this anxiety. She says, I mean, parents think that us school can do what it likes, but finally the girls are ours and we'll just do whatever we have to. What they underestimate is the power of the subversive pedagogy, because it changes you. It changes. Once it changes the way you look at yourself, the work is really done, because then you start acting your life differently. And when you do that, you force people to look at you differently, right? From middle-class families and teachers, I've had these criticisms that, aren't you making them unfit, misfit in their own context? Yes, we are. And in fact, that's our goal, to help them be misfits so they are motivated to change their context and fit in. What is the alternative? Do nothing? If you can see anyone minimally, then you treat them minimally. So the goal has been, no, you will, let's conceive them maximally and then find great opportunities and possibilities for them.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that. That's a really clear and I think forceful response to that critique. Last
there's a hand. Yeah,
sorry,
there's a hand.
Oh, there's
Pia
a hand.
has a hand. Yes.
Feel free to unmute and ask your question. Yep.
It just reminded me, I had many years ago a conversation with Heiner Müller in East Germany at the time. And Heiner Müller says, in order to change the world, you have to create an utopia. And it reminds me very much as you have to create hope. So
thanks, Pia.
Thanks, Pia. I love a Heiner Müller reference in a create. We don't have enough discussion of Heiner Müller, in my view. As an I was in a Heiner Müller play once, weirdly, which probably makes me the only person in Australia who has been.
Which one did you do, Heiner Müller play?
Hamlet Machine.
Oh, yeah. We did it in the Playhouse. We did it.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful
play.
Yeah, wonderful. Any other questions? Okay, we've got a policy here at Create that we don't allow kind of long silences, but one of the things that I wanted to say to both of you, and actually everyone who's been on this wonderful kind of session, is that there's such richness in this work. And in a sense, what you're reflecting in your work is work that you could hear all around the world, but you've managed, I think, to pull out such thoughtful insights and such exciting insights. And I just really commend this book to everybody who's interested in this area, because It is a really powerful way of understanding the research. I think it takes verbatim theatre to a new place. And that 13-year conversation, I think you described it as, Andrew, has really produced some wonderful, rich discussion. And I hope that this isn't the end, and it doesn't feel like the end. It just feels like kind of that we're part of an ongoing discussion. So I'd like to thank you so much for sharing that work with us today, and also recommend that anyone who's interested go to that book and keep following this work, because I think it's absolutely fabulous. But thanks so much, Kathleen and Andrew, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Interesting conversation.
Thank you to everyone for being here, and Michael and Anna for all of the work you've done to make this, to realize this event. And Andrew, I love you. I love speaking with you and sharing our work. I'm really grateful for the questions and the engagement. And yes, let's keep talking. Exactly, Michael. More to discover.
Thanks so much. Have a great day or evening wherever you are, and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.